Why question what you can't see? Mankind took for granted the air it breathed, and we paid a price.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Wolfwraith and welcome to another episode of In the Mist, the series where I talk about a game I'm in the midst of playing and the impression it makes. Today we're talking about Traverser. This is a game that was released on the 10th of July in 2015 and it was made by a company called Gatling Goat Studios. If you like taking the mechanics of a game, then using them in unintentional and immature ways, or if you like taking a gravity-shifting glove and using it to beat NPCs over the head with floating objects, then there's a chance you'll like Traverser. But this isn't entirely what the game is about. Gatling Goat Studios have done a pretty decent job of creating a narrative and atmosphere filled with mystery, puzzles, and even boss fights, all of which entice you to play further into the game. Traverser is set in a world where the sun has died, so it forces whatever's left of the human race to live beneath the planet's surface, and this allows them to live as close as possible to the last remaining heat source. The game takes place in Brimstone, which is a fictional city divided into upper and lower classes. Both classes are controlled by the Raven Corp, a corporation that controls the city's breathable air supply. Naturally, in keeping with typical archetypes, the wealthier upper class gets most of the air supply for themselves. This is where Valerie Bennett steps in, a young girl who passes her test to become a Traverser, which is a peacekeeper of sorts, and Traversers are given a tool to traverse between the upper and lower cities of Brimstone. Throughout the game, you'll accompany your mostly silent protagonist Valerie on her journey to uncover the secrets of the Raven Corporation. Despite being silent during gameplay, it's implied that Valerie is the narrator for the cutscene that occurs during the start of the game and is likely to be the narrator of all other cutscenes if there are any more. As you play, she'll also document her thoughts in a journal, giving you a way to track the story. Valerie might be young, but her character is portrayed as someone much more mature than she needs to be. This is understandable because she's grown up in a different world to what most of us have. Not only that, but Valerie helps look after her dad, who's currently sick because of the lack of air. In fact, your first mission is to run down to a local merchant to pick up a canister of air for your dad. The game does really well to convey Valerie's helpful nature, and her maturity is also complemented fairly well with the voice acting provided for her character.
Well, if it isn't young Valerie Bennett, fabled daughter of one of Raven Corporation's brightest employees. How are you? You look rested. That's good. Big day today, eh?
The story is balanced well between Valerie's thoughts and dialogue provided by other supporting characters and antagonists. Each character has their own personality, which is again conveyed fairly well through their dialogue and voice acting. Other NPCs you encounter around the city will talk among themselves and sometimes say silly things to add a bit of humor as well as adding a bit of life to the city. Within the first 30 minutes of the game, you're already introduced to the antagonist, but he's not introduced as such. Instead, he is introduced as Edgar Foss. When you meet him, you instantly get this vibe that he's not really a nice fella. The overview of the game isn't exactly all that enticing as well, but seeing the way Valerie's dad is affected by the air shortage made me curious and long to delve further into the game. There was a mystery there, not a big one, but one that Gatling Goat Studios made me want to solve nonetheless. Once you're done running the errand for your dad, the game starts to get a bit more serious and makes you go through a tutorial. Now, you are a Traverser in training, so what could the developers possibly do to train you and your character? Well, they simply make you go through the training exam required to become a Traverser. Despite the hand-holding, it does integrate into the game and narrative really well. It also does it in an amusing way. During the tutorial, you'll end up in a test chamber, which is sort of like a training and examination area for potential Traversers, and there's a few TVs that have voice-recorded messages, and each of them shows you a tutorial. Each one is delivered with a 2D cartoon featuring a man called Traverser Freddy. In a very cheery manner, Freddy will solve puzzles and demonstrates how to use certain equipment or techniques, and this loops over and over until you switch off the bloody screen. By now, this should sound pretty familiar to you. If not, I'll give you a hint. Vault Boy. The tutorial system amused me because the video tutorials felt very reminiscent of the Fallout titles. Things do seem like they start off slow, but once you unlock the main tool, which is the gravity glove, things do get a bit more interesting, although a bit more fidgety as well. The gravity glove itself is fairly simple to use. You mouse over an object and pick it up with left click, then move it around with the mouse. Controlling the floating objects can be a bit tricky though, but the physics and weightiness of these objects actually adds a bit of authenticity. You can raise and lower objects with the mouse wheel and even rotate them by holding down right click. But this is where things get a little trickier. Holding down left click and scrolling the mouse wheel to raise or lower objects isn't the most elegant use of a mouse and keyboard. Obviously, it was designed in such a way that you can still move around when controlling objects. Fortunately, you can rebind the controls if you have a mouse with extra buttons, otherwise you might struggle to find a decent binding that suits you. The controls in Traversa are simple enough. Your WASD to move, F to interact, space to jump, and shift to My Surprise makes your character tiptoe around. There is one pet peeve I have with the controls, and that's the lack of controller support. In fact, it's actually non-existent. Having controller support could have helped to solve the problem with raising and lowering objects, even if it's not a major problem. For the most part, the gameplay is simple and a bit rudimentary, but it's also fun and relaxing. The combat primarily involves just smacking things over the head with floating objects. When it comes to boss fights, it requires a bit of puzzle solving to defeat them. The game does have some minor stealth mechanics which primarily involve tiptoeing around enemies or avoiding their line of sight. It doesn't have full-on stealth mechanics where you hide behind cover or anything though. While there is platforming in the game, it's fairly simple to start off with. It does okay to provide some sort of a challenge though. At its core, the game is primarily about puzzle solving. The puzzles is where the game complements the other mechanics really well. They range from something as simple as stacking boxes to reach a ledge, to using a limited amount of pipes to fill a sewer system with liquid that causes platforms to raise high enough for you to cross them. To shake things up a bit, the flip stations can be used to solve puzzles in different ways. It may require you to use a flip station to go to a certain level, solve a puzzle there, so that you can go back to solve a puzzle in a previous level. I actually haven't encountered a lot of bugs when playing this, but I did encounter one somewhat game-breaking bug that allows you to get stuck in certain areas. The only way to get out of it is to reload to a previous save file. In the developer's defense, this was partially my fault for messing around, climbing and jumping into places I shouldn't have been in the first place, but at the same time, good developers generally preempt this sort of thing and act accordingly, unless Gatling Goat Studios did and felt that the punishment of being stuck behind a carriage was just enough to stop players like myself from misbehaving. One little touch I liked and feel is worth noting was that the game console in Valerid's room could actually be used to play a minigame. Probably one of the most notable and interesting things I found in the game is the journal. It's actually required for navigation because there's no radar or map in the game. When you're given a mission, Valerie records her thoughts about it and notes down where she needs to go. And she'll do this by naming a street and the building she needs to get to. This means as you're exploring or going to your objective, you have to keep a lookout for shop names or street signs that will guide you to your destination. This might sound worrying for some people, but fortunately the game world seems large enough for a bit of exploration, but small enough that finding your destination isn't tedious. While the areas are big enough for exploration, there isn't much incentive to do so, apart from collectibles, but they provide no rewards that benefit your character. The visuals in Traversa aren't exactly the most eye-catching or high-tech visuals you could get in the game, but behind its simple and cartoony visuals is a decently stylish and detailed world. It conveys a society that's having to live through a really tough time by making things look gloomy and depressing. This is complemented well by the 2D hand-drawn style cinematics. Other notable things I liked were that when you spoke to NPCs, it had a little portrait of the NPC with their name and even their occupation or something of relevance to that NPC, like inventory or failed traverser. It helped to add a bit of humor when it described the NPC with something unnecessary or ridiculous. Another thing I liked was that buildings would fade out when the camera went behind them, so it helped to avoid any annoying camera angles and wouldn't constrict your view. Now, before I continue on with the rest of the video, if you'd like to know more about Traversa, there will be links in the description. It's currently around 19 Australian dollars on Steam, or $14.99 US if I recall. I grabbed it on sale for about $4 US, and I'm definitely satisfied with the game so far. I think it's worth taking a look at if you're interested, and then decide from there whether you want to grab it, or better yet, just wishlist it now and decide later. I feel like it's one of those games that should end up on your playlist, not necessarily right away, but it's good enough to be on the backlog. I certainly intend on finishing this one as soon as I can. I'd also like to thank Gatling Goat Studios, the developers, and Adult Swim Games, the publishers, all in advance for allowing me to showcase this lovely game. I'd also like to thank each and every one of you, because if you're hearing this, it means you've taken your own time to watch this video, and I really do appreciate that. While I haven't played that much of Traversa, and from what I've seen so far, what they've done with the game doesn't seem like something crazy intriguing. But once I got into the game, the mystery that imbues itself in the story makes me more and more curious. The ability to throw and trash any object around makes me amused and will pander to anyone's inner child. When it comes to puzzles, a thing that I detest in video games, Gatling Goat Studios have done fairly well to make them both logical and creative so that players with all levels of intelligence can enjoy them, be you someone who thinks slow or someone who thinks fast. Traversa might not be revolutionizing anything, and that's perfectly okay, because despite that, so far the experience has been nothing but engaging.